The brass was perfect. She had polished it 3 times already that night, and she could have polished it 30, and the shine at the base of that particular lamp would still be hers, clean as water, smooth as a lie, right up until the moment the man in the midnight blue suit stepped out of the elevator on the 14th floor of the Meridian Crown Hotel, looked once down the corridor with eyes the color of a frozen river, and put the sole of his $700 Italian shoe directly on top of her work. He did not do it quickly. He did it the way a man pins a butterfly to a board. "There's a mark," he said softly. "I believe you'll need to fix that." The hallway went perfectly still. Behind him, 2 Valenti soldiers shifted their weight almost imperceptibly, the way predators shift when they smell blood. Beside him, a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit stopped mid-sentence on his phone and looked down the carpet at her for the first time, a flicker of something cold in his eyes. Somewhere in the walls, a ventilation fan clicked on. She did not flinch. She did not raise her head beyond the regulation 2 inches. She did not do any of the small, shrinking things that women in housekeeping uniforms were supposed to do when the most dangerous man in New York City decided to make them his footrest. She simply reached for her polishing cloth, unfolded it once, and cleaned the scuff off his shoe. 2 slow passes, careful around the stitching, the way a craftsman handles a piece she respects, not the way a servant handles a master. When she was done, she folded the cloth, placed it back on the tray, and lowered her head the regulation 2 inches. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Dante Valenti did not answer for 3 full seconds. They would be the most expensive 3 seconds of his entire life. He did not know, standing in that hallway, that the woman on her knees owned the hotel beneath him. He did not know she owned the block outside. He did not know she owned a luxury empire that stretched from Manhattan to Monte Carlo, or that she had spent 6 years studying his every move from inside a room full of monitors, or that she had been sent, once, at the age of 18, to put a bullet through the back of his neck. He did not know that the man at his shoulder, the Consigliere he called family, the silver-haired advisor his own father had trusted, had been running him like a puppet for 24 years, and was, at that precise moment, 3 hours away from having him shot to death in a dining room on the 32nd floor. He did not know that the quiet woman refusing to lower her eyes to him was the only person in the city who was trying to keep him alive. And he did not know this would be the part that undid him later, that she had not come to kneel in that hallway as a maid, or as an avenger, or as a stranger. She had come there as the only woman left in the world who had ever loved him without knowing him, and who had decided, against every rule she had set for herself, to save his life before she introduced herself. Everything Dante Valenti thought he owned, his name, his empire, his face, his own heart, was about to stop being his. And it was going to start with a shoe on a brass lamp. His name was carried in whispers before it was ever spoken aloud. Dante Valenti was 41 years old, and he had been running the Valenti family since he was 20. His hair was dark and silvering at the temples. His jaw was cut sharp enough that his lieutenants joked you could file paperwork on it. He wore a midnight blue suit tailored in London, a watch that cost more than most Manhattan apartments, and an expression that had not meaningfully changed since the morning of his 17th birthday, when his father was shot to death in front of him at a butcher's shop in Little Italy. He had learned, in that shop, at the age of 17, the single most important lesson of his life. It had come from his father's mouth, not at the end, near the end, a minute before the man with kind eyes had walked in with a package wrapped in brown paper. The most dangerous person in any room, Dante, is always the one you don't see. He had made his life around that lesson. He had trained himself to see. He had trained himself to identify the one unafraid person in a room full of frightened people, to clock the angle of a car's approach on a side street, to measure the silences inside a conversation. He had built an organization on his own capacity for noticing. He had made enemies of 5 crews and buried all 5. He had consolidated the Valenti family into a vertical operation with 3 legitimate industries, fronting every dollar and one quiet philosophy underneath it all. See everything, reveal nothing. It had worked for 24 years. It would stop working on a Thursday night in November, in a hallway on the 14th floor of a hotel he had never been inside. The trip had been Falcone's idea. Luca Falcone was 58 years old, tall and thin and silver-haired, the kind of man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. He had been Dante's father's consigliere for 11 years before Dante's father died. He had been Dante's consigliere for every one of the 24 years since. He wore charcoal suits and small gold cufflinks and the permanent, indulgent half-smile of a man who had survived every purge by being slightly to the left of where the bullets were aimed. He carried a leather portfolio everywhere. Nobody had ever seen inside it. 2 weeks before the Meridian Crown, at a long lunch at Rouse, Falcone had done a small thing he had been doing more and more often for 11 months. He had, in front of 3 capos and a lieutenant named Rixai, corrected Dante on a point of fact in the Jersey roots. The correction had not been sharp. It had been affectionate, "You're tired, Dante. You're misremembering the Patterson tonnage," and delivered with the indulgent smile of a man who had been tying the boss's shoelaces since the boss was small enough to need help with shoelaces. The table had laughed. Dante had laughed. The correction had been wrong. The Patterson tonnage had been what Dante said it was, which Dante could have proven with a phone call. He had not made the phone call. He had let the correction stand. He had caught across the table, Rixai's eyes moving not to him, but to Falcone for instructions. He had logged it. He had not acted on it. He had been doing that for 11 months. Falcone had been rehearsing, in front of his soldiers, the voice of the man who would be speaking for the Valenti family after Dante was dead. Dante had seen the rehearsal. He had not yet named what he had seen, but the name had been lining up in his head, patient as a tumor, for almost a year. Falcone had come to Dante 6 weeks after the lunch at Rouse with the plan for the Meridian Crown sit-down. Victor Petrov of the Brighton Beach Russians had been bleeding the Valenti docks for 11 months, he said. 2 of Dante's men had vanished off a pier. A shipping container of Petrov merchandise had caught fire in a Valenti warehouse. Neither side had admitted. Both sides knew. If the cycle continued another 3 months, Falcone argued, they would be burying lieutenants by Christmas. Neutral ground asterisk, Falcone had said. The Meridian Crown, top floor. No weapons, no lieutenants. You, Victor, 1 mediator each. 2 hours. Walk out with a treaty or walk out with a target. Dante had agreed. He had not looked carefully at who had suggested the Meridian Crown, or at the small half-smile at the corner of Falcone's mouth when he named it, or at the way Falcone's hand, the one that carried the portfolio, had closed slightly tighter on the leather when the name came out. He had not looked because he had not known to look. Falcone had counted on that. They rode up from the lobby in the private elevator. Dante leaned against the brass rail. He had not slept in 29 hours. The thin, bright ache behind his eyes was a companion he had long since stopped resenting. The Russians are tired, Falcone said. His voice was low and steady. Victor came up by himself, his mediators already in the suite. Rixai swept the hallways an hour ago. The east staircase is clean. I've got a car on the service dock in case we need a fast departure. The terms from Romano still hold. Of course, Dante, of course. Falcone paused, the smallest pause. Though I would mention the concession on the Jersey routes, if Victor smells softness tonight. They hold, Luca. Of course. Dante's eyes moved, for the briefest of seconds, across his consigliere's face. Something was off. He could not have said what. He was a man who could identify the angle of a car's approach on a side street, and something about the composition of his old friend's smile, standing beside him in this elevator, was off by half a degree. The smile reached a little further up the cheek than usual. The weight on the leather portfolio was slightly too firm. The breath through his nose was slightly too even. If Dante had been rested, he would have noticed. He was not rested. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. Dante stepped out onto the 14th floor and saw her. She was at the far end of the corridor, crouched on her heels, polishing the brass base of a floor lamp. Her uniform was the standard Meridian Crown livery, black dress, white collar, silver crown pin over her heart. Her hair was dark, almost black, pulled back so tight it could have been painted on. Her hands were pale and steady. She did not look up when the elevator chimed. She did not look up when Dante and Falcone stepped onto the carpet. She did not look up when the two Valenti bodyguards moved past Dante and took their positions at the hallway's exits. She simply kept polishing, a faint frown of concentration at the corner of her mouth, as if the tarnish on this particular lamp had personally insulted her family going back 4 generations. Dante's first thought was a very old thought, a thought he had not had in 10 years. The most dangerous person in any room is always the one you don't see. His second thought was that he was seeing this one very clearly, which meant she had wanted him too. His third thought, which he could not have explained to anyone, and which he did not attempt to explain to himself, was that the back of her neck, where the dark hair pulled away from the collar of her uniform, was one of the most deliberate pieces of composition he had ever looked at. He took 3 slow steps down the corridor toward her. Falcone, already halfway to the suite door, glanced back once and kept walking. Dante's shadow fell across her work. The polishing cloth paused. She lifted her head. She had gray eyes, not the pale gray of winter, but the deeper slate of a storm gathering over the ocean. She was younger than he'd expected, late 20s, maybe 30, with a face that was symmetrical in the way that only certain ancient bloodlines managed. Cheekbones high, mouth wide, a thin pale scar above her left eyebrow that she had made no effort to cover. Her expression was perfectly neutral. "Sir," she said. One word, clean, American, no accent he could place. "You are polishing a lamp," Dante said. "I am, sir." "In the middle of a hallway." "It's my route, sir." In 24 years, Dante Valenti had never met a person who had looked at him this way. Not the fake meekness of a servant, not the predatory stillness of someone with a weapon, a flat, unreadable calm, a stranger passing him in a crowded station. He was, in the oldest possible meaning of the word, arrested. And because he was arrested, and because he had not slept, and because a part of him that he no longer admitted to having wanted, suddenly, to see this quiet woman break, he did the thing he was going to spend a great deal of time regretting. He stepped forward, put the sole of his shoe on her brass, held it there. "There's a mark," he said softly. "I believe you'll need to fix that." He watched her face. She did not blink. She did not sigh. She did not glance, as he half expected her to, toward the 2 bodyguards at the ends of the hallway. She simply reached for the polishing cloth on her tray, unfolded it once, and cleaned the scuff off his shoe. 2 slow passes, careful around the stitching. Halfway through the second pass, she did something he did not expect. She lifted her free hand, and with the back of 2 fingers, touched his trouser cuff, the lightest possible pressure, a fractional adjustment of the fabric's hang against his sock. The gesture was so small and so specific that for a moment he thought he had imagined it. Then she placed the cloth back on the tray and lowered her head 2 inches. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Dante did not speak. The touch on the cuff had rearranged him internally in a way that he could not, at that moment, map. It had not been flirtation. It had been the absent-minded grooming of a woman who had dressed wealthy men her entire life. A wife's gesture. A queen's gesture. Not a maid's. He became aware, with a low, quiet clarity, that he was being introduced to something. "Your name," he said. "Vivienne, sir." "Vivienne what?" A pause, the tiniest pause. "Reyes, sir." "Vivienne Reyes." He rolled it around. "Tell me, Vivienne Reyes, how long have you worked in this hotel?" 3 years, sir." "And do you always take so little offense at being used as a shoe shine?" "I take exactly the amount of offense my salary pays me to take, sir." Behind him, one of his bodyguards made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Dante did not laugh. He leaned down just slightly, just enough to bring his face a foot from hers. He could smell her. Not perfume, something plainer, cleaner, like fresh linen and rosemary. There was no fear on her breath. "Be careful, Vivienne Reyes," he said very quietly. "You are a long way from the ground floor." "So are you, sir," she said. And her eyes moved, not in fear. A flicker, only a flicker of something bright and knowing under the slate-gray surface. Something that said, I see exactly who you are, and I am not afraid. Something that said, you have no idea whose house you just walked into. It was gone before he could be certain it had been there. He straightened. He stepped back. He walked to his suite without another word. As he turned the corner, he heard the soft metallic click of her polishing tray being lifted, the whisper of her shoes on the carpet. Behind his back, a third figure paused at the far end of the hallway. Luca Falcone had stopped, one hand on the knob of the suite door, and he was watching Vivienne Reyes rise smoothly from her knees and walk away from the lamp. His head tilted, half an inch, like a man hearing a sound that was familiar that he could not quite place. He watched her until she disappeared around the corner. Then he opened the suite door and went in, and he did not say a word to Dante about the maid he had just seen, which was, in retrospect, the first mistake he made that night. The second would come 20 minutes later, in a bathroom, on a phone call he should not have made within the walls of a hotel. He did not know he was being filmed inside. 4 floors down, in a service closet that was not a service closet, Vivienne Marchetti Crown pressed her palm against a panel that scanned her print. The panel opened onto a room the size of a walk-in closet, lined with monitors. On every monitor was a live feed from a different camera on the 14th floor. She sat down. She removed the crown pin from her chest and set it carefully in a velvet-lined tray. She put on a headset. She watched Dante Valenti enter his suite. She watched his profile move to the window. She watched him turn the wine glass slowly in his fingers, staring at the glass of the skyline with an expression that, if she had been a less disciplined woman, would have hollowed her out the way it had been hollowing her out for 3 years. She was 31 years old. She had been, for 7 years, preparing for the moment she had just finished having in a hallway on the 14th floor of her own hotel. Her legal name appeared on the incorporation documents of the Crown Collection Group, a privately held hospitality empire comprising 23 properties across 4 continents. The Meridian Crown was not the largest of her properties. It was simply the oldest. Her grandfather had built it in 1929, 4 months before the crash. Her father had taken over from her grandfather in 1987. Her father had been murdered inside it in March of a year Vivienne did not like to name aloud, 8 days before her 15th birthday. She had been 3 blocks away at the time, at a piano lesson. She could still remember the piece she had been playing. It had been Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Op. 9 No. 2, a piece her father loved, a piece that began with a single note repeated 3 times, soft as a whisper, the right hand asking a question the left hand never quite answered. Her teacher had been old Mrs. Vassilieva, a Russian woman with ropey hands and a cigarette voice, who did not believe in children and did not believe in comfort, and who made Vivienne play the nocturne at half the printed tempo until Vivienne wept with boredom and only then allowed her to play it at speed. Vivienne had been 14. She had been small for her age, thin-wristed, sharp-eyed, already speaking 4 languages, already tired of how much her father worried about her. It was a Tuesday. It was raining. Mrs. Vassilieva's apartment had smelled of bergamot tea and old paper. Vivienne had been halfway through the 2nd page, the modulation into the minor. The small, chromatic stumble that her father had told her was the heart of the piece. When Mrs. Vassilieva had lifted her head and said, in her cigarette voice, "Stop asterisk." Vivienne had stopped. There had been a sound outside. Sirens, several of them, going the wrong way. Mrs. Vassilieva had walked to the window. She had stood at the window a long time. Then she had turned around and knelt down in front of the piano bench, which was not a thing she had ever done for a child, ever, and she had taken Vivienne's 2 cold hands in her 2 cold hands and said, "My dear, I need you to stay in this room for a very little while." Vivienne had stayed. She had stayed for 3 hours. When Mrs. Vassilieva came back, her eyes had been red, and she had said, in a voice that Vivienne had never heard from her, "My child, they have taken him." And Vivienne, at the age of 14, looking up at her ropey-handed teacher, had understood the grammar of the sentence in a way that only certain children understand grammar, which was that the word taken did not mean kidnapped, and the word him did not mean anyone else. She had not cried in that room. She had not cried in the car back to the hotel. She had not cried in the lobby where the police officers had been standing. She had not cried when the executor of her father's estate, a small, balding man named Mr. Whitfield, had sat down beside her on the lobby bench at 2 a.m. and explained, in the softest voice he could manage, that there were certain paperwork matters that the trust would now need to address. She had cried, for the first and only time in the next 16 years of her life, on a plane to Switzerland, 3 months later, with her forehead against a window, flying over an ocean she had never seen before. Then she had stopped. The girl who got off the plane in Geneva had not been the girl who got on in New York. The girl who got off had understood one thing very clearly. She had understood that the invisible people in every room were the ones who survived, and that being invisible was a skill, and that she would spend the rest of her life learning it. She had been very good at the learning. She was watching Dante Valenti's profile on the monitor now, 16 years later, with the same clinical attention she had once given to a Chopin nocturne. "Raphael," she said into the headset. The voice in her ear was older, male, steady. "Ma'am." "Walk me through the rooms." "Valenti is in 1404. Falcone is en route to the bathroom. He'll be on a call in approximately 60 seconds. Victor Petrov is in the penthouse with his mediator. I have 3 men in the walls of the 32nd floor dining room and 2 in the stairwell. The shooter has not yet arrived on property. Our tracker places him in a car on 48th Street. How long until he enters? Best estimate, 40 minutes. Good. What about Falcone's phone? Mirrored. You'll have audio the moment he places the call. Thank you, Raphael. A pause, a different voice now, softer, more personal. Vivienne. Yes. Are you sure you want to do it this way? I'm sure. You don't owe him the courtesy. I'm not doing it as a courtesy. Raphael was quiet for a moment. I raised you, he said finally. I taught you to do this work in the first place, and I have never in 15 years seen you commit a resource to a single target without cost-benefit. So I am asking, because it is my job to ask, are you sure you want to do it this way? Vivienne did not answer for a long time. On the monitor, Dante had set the wine glass down. He was rubbing the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, a gesture she had watched him make 2,000 times on 2,000 different nights. The gesture of a tired man who had not slept enough and did not know why he could not sleep. She said, I'm sure, Raphael. All right. Bring me the intercept from Falcone's. Call the moment he makes it. Yes, ma'am. She cut the line. She pressed her palm flat against the surface of the console. For a single second, she allowed herself to close her eyes. The first time she had seen Dante Valenti with her own eyes, not through a lens, not through a file, not through a report, had been 3 years ago on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. A Tuesday, March. The light had been the gray gold of early spring in a city that did not want to let winter go. She had been in the back of a car, behind tinted glass, 2 lanes from his. She had been in Brooklyn for a property appraisal on a building she was not, in the end, going to buy. He had been in the front passenger seat of a black SUV. Falcone had been driving. His car had stopped in the middle of traffic. She had watched him get out. She had watched him walk 20 feet into the road, through 4 lanes of stopped cars, toward something on the asphalt she could not at first see. A horn had blared. He had raised one hand, palm flat, without turning his head, and the horn had stopped. Then she had seen it. A dog, small, some kind of terrier mix, gray and white, with a frayed rope around its neck and a limp. It had been in the middle of the avenue, spinning in place, panicked. A little girl had been on the sidewalk weeping into her mother's jacket. Dante had crouched down. He had held one hand out to the dog, flat, palm down, the way her grandfather had taught her to hold hands out to animals a long time ago. The dog had stopped spinning. It had walked, 3-legged, toward his hand. He had gathered it into his arms, both arms, no concern for his suit, and carried it to the curb. He had put it down in front of the little girl. He had crouched down again, this time to speak to the girl. Vivienne had been too far away to hear. The girl had nodded. She had nodded 3 times. She had laid one small hand on the top of the dog's head. Dante had stood up. He had walked back to the SUV. He had gotten in. The SUV had pulled away. The whole episode had taken 93 seconds. Vivienne had timed it because she had timed everything about him for 3 years at that point. She had logged it in her notes under * aberrant behavior, because she had been, at the time, still committed to the hypothesis that the man she was watching was a mechanical thing, an engine of violence, a shadow in a suit. She had watched that 93 seconds back, alone in her apartment that night, on a surveillance clip Raphael had pulled, and she had watched it back 27 times. The thing she could not get past was his face when he handed the dog to the little girl. It was a face that did not know anyone was watching. It was, she had realized, the first time she had seen Dante Valenti's face when he did not know anyone was watching. She had cried at the monitor. Not in a way she had cried before. A small, dry crying. The crying of a person understanding, very slowly, that a thing they had been building their entire life was maybe not the correct thing to have been building. She had called Raphael that night. She had said, "I need you to pull every file we have, every Sunday morning, every off-schedule stop, every piece of movement that doesn't fit the criminal profile. I want all of it. I want to know who he is when he doesn't think anyone is watching." Raphael had been silent for a while. Then he had said, "Vivienne, be careful." She had said, "I know." She had been careful. She had been clinical. She had spent the next 3 years assembling a second file, parallel to the one she had been assembling for 6 years, a file that did not contain crimes. A file of visits to a grandmother's grave. A file of anonymous transfers to a family in the Bronx whose firefighter father had died in a warehouse blaze started by one of the crews that used to terrorize the neighborhood before Dante bought the block and quietly evicted them. A file of phone calls to a pediatric hospital in Queens that received $1 million a year from an anonymous donor, routed through a Swiss account that she, Vivienne, had, God help her, helped to set up, never knowing. She had been building a ledger of a man's goodness in parallel to the ledger of his sins. And somewhere, in the 4th year, she had noticed something else. Every act of goodness was committed in opposition to Luca Falcone. Everyone. She had understood, slowly, that Dante Valenti was trying to repair things that Luca Falcone was breaking, and that Luca Falcone was the one telling him what was broken and what was not. The man she had thought for 6 years was the monster was, it turned out, the only person holding the monster in check. Badly, partially, with his hands tied behind his back by loyalty and grief. But holding. She had not told anyone this for another year. Not Raphael, not herself really. She had just watched. And somewhere in the 5th year, she had stopped being able to imagine a world in which the only just outcome was Dante Valenti's death. She had started imagining. Instead, a world in which the man who had actually killed her father paid for it. And in which the man whose name had been wrapped around those crimes, the man who visited his grandmother's grave every Sunday with white roses, was forced, finally, to see what had been done with his name. That world had required that Dante Valenti live past Thursday night. On the monitor in front of her, his hand moved away from the bridge of his nose. He picked up the wine glass again. He did not drink from it. The line in her ear clicked. Raphael's voice came back, clipped and urgent. "We have Falcon on the phone, patching through now." A breath of static, then a new voice, low and careful, speaking in Italian. "It's on schedule, 9:45. Make sure the shooter knows the north exit is clear." Vivienne did not move. And the Petrovs. They believe Dante is arriving armed. Dante believes the same. Both parties will be tense. It will look like a misunderstanding that got out of hand. I'll handle the narrative afterward. A pause, a small laugh, dry, mirthless. 24 years, Ronaldo. 24 years I have kept this family standing on his shoulders because his father told me the boy would do. Tonight I stop carrying a man who was never worth the wait. The call cut. Vivienne opened her eyes. She had, for one of the very few times in her adult life, a flare of pure personal rage. Not the controlled rage she had been living with for 20 years. A clean, bright anger, so clean it was almost cold. Tonight I stopped carrying a man who was never worth the wait. Luca Falcone had said the same thing about her father once, in a conversation she had only ever heard third hand through a former Valenti lieutenant turned informant 2.5 years ago. The same phrasing, the same dismissive arithmetic, never worth the wait. It was, Vivienne understood, how he had talked about her mother. She pressed the button on her console. Raphael, move the timeline. Moving to 9:30. No, earlier. I want the sit-down pushed to 9. I want Victor Petrov on the 30th floor in 10 minutes. I want the real story in his hands before he sits down with anyone. And I want Falcone's shooter intercepted and taken alive before he enters the building. Understood. And Raphael? Yes. Tonight, I walk him into the dining room myself. A pause. Ma'am, that is not the plan. The plan has changed, Raphael. Are you sure? I am sure. She cut the line. She stood up. She turned off the monitors. She straightened her uniform because she was going back into the hall, and she was going to do what she had told herself for the entire drive over that she would not do. She was going to deliver a plate of burrata to 1404 in person, and she was going to stand in that doorway for exactly 1 minute and let the man inside begin to understand that the night he had walked into had never been his to walk into. Falcone had done the first reckless thing now, the phone call, the words. The rest of the night belonged to her. 3 floors up, Luca Falcone closed the bathroom door behind himself and returned to the sitting room of Suite 1404. He crossed to the bar. He did not like to drink before meetings, but he permitted himself half a finger of Amaro tonight because his hand was steady, and he wanted to confirm it was steady. He poured. His hand was steady. He nodded to himself and set the glass down. 24 years. He had always known it would happen on his terms, on a schedule of his making, in a room he had rented, on a night he had chosen. He was the sort of man who lost no sleep over the actual events he was required to cause. He had lost sleep, in his life, only twice. Once, the night before he had Niccolo Marchetti shot. Once, the night before he had the old Valenti patriarch shot. Both occasions because the preparation had been complex and he had been worried about logistics. This one was not complex. This one had been prepared for 11 days. He crossed the sitting room. He stopped by the sofa where Dante was, still standing by the window, holding the untouched wine glass in 2 fingers. You look tired, Falcone said, soft. I am tired. Rest after the meeting, Dante. Let me handle the post call. I'll call Romano. I'll call D'Amato. You'll wake up in the morning and the city will be quieter. Dante did not turn. Luca. Yes. Do you remember my father? Falcone paused. He had not been asked that question in 19 years, not by Dante. The young boss had a rule about it, an unspoken rule, the way certain widowers had rules about photographs. I remember him, Falcone said carefully. Do you remember what he told me at the shop, before? I wasn't in the shop, Dante. I was parking the car. He told me the most dangerous person in any room is always the one you don't see. Falcone let out a thin, fond laugh. Your father was a romantic, Dante. He loved an aphorism. He used to quote it at christenings. He was right, though. He was right. Dante turned. He looked at Falcone for a long moment. His ice-gray eyes did not move. I've been thinking about it lately, he said. Have you? I think about it often lately. Why? I don't know. Falcone held the look. His indulgent smile stayed exactly where it needed to be. Underneath it, somewhere below his solar plexus, a small cold animal opened its eyes for the first time in 24 years. It's a good instinct, Falcone said. Keep it close. I always have. There was a knock at the door. Room service, sir. Her voice. Dante set the wine glass down. He did not walk to the door. He stood very still, and for a moment Falcone saw something on the younger man's face that Falcone did not like. A faint quickening. A faint awakening. "I'll handle it," Falcone said. "Sit down, Luca. I'll handle it." Falcone sat. The cold animal under his ribs uncurled, very slowly, the whole length of itself. He watched Dante cross to the door. He watched Dante open it. He watched the dark-haired maid from the hallway, who was not, now that Falcone looked at her properly, a maid his age and his eye would have ever categorized as a maid, wheel a small silver cart into the room. On the cart was a plate of burrata with tomato and basil, a carafe of water, a folded napkin, and on top of the napkin a single white rose. Falcone's eyes went to the rose. His jaw tightened. White roses were what Dante carried every Sunday to his grandmother Nonne Rosa's grave at Calvary Cemetery. Nobody outside the Valenti family, nobody outside the 5 men who had stood at Nonne's burial 6 months ago should have known that detail. It was not written anywhere. It was a private devotion. Falcone looked from the rose to the maid. And for the first time in the long, steady career of his private violence, Luca Falcone felt the oldest cold instinct of his own trade wake up along the back of his neck. He had seen this woman before. Not in this hallway, not in this hotel, somewhere older, somewhere darker. He could not place it. He sat very still on the sofa and watched her set the plate down. Dante said, "You brought the wrong rose." "Sir, white roses are for grief. Burrata plates get red." The maid's mouth moved, very slightly. "I know, sir," she said. She turned to leave. "Wait," Dante said. She stopped. "What's your mother's name?" "Vivienne Reyes." Falcone's head moved, a fraction of an inch, toward the maid. The maid did not turn fully. She turned only enough for him to see her profile. "Rosa, sir." Dante said nothing. The maid walked out, pulling the cart behind her. The door closed. On the sofa, Luca Falcone sat with his half-finger of Amaro and did not drink it. The cold animal under his ribs was the full length of his torso now and turning slowly to look at him. Rosa. There had been a Rosa in his life once, long ago, 32 years, which was a long time for a man like Falcone to remember a name. He could still feel, if he permitted himself to, the summer the name belonged to. He had been 26, a junior consigliere with 3 suits to his name and a sharp, hungry face and nowhere yet to spend his ambition. She had been 21, working behind the front desk of her father's hotel on 49th Street for the summer before she finished her degree at Columbia, a girl with a laugh that started low in her throat and came out sideways. She had fed him a pastry one August afternoon, off a silver tray, and she had laughed when he made a joke about the pastry chef. It was the single most expensive pastry of Falcone's life. He had decided eating it that he was going to marry her. He had courted her for 7 months. He had brought her flowers. He had brought her books of poetry he had not read. He had taken her once to the opera and held her hand through the 2nd act, and she had permitted it. Not with love, but with a small apologetic tenderness that he had mistaken for something warmer. He had been planning the ring. She had, on a Wednesday in March of the following year, told him, kindly, that she was going to marry a man named Niccolo Marchetti. Falcone had asked her why. She had said, "Because he sees me." Those had been the 3 words. He had driven home from that conversation with his hands tight on the wheel and had promised himself, that night, that he would one day own every room Rosa Marchetti ever walked into, and that Niccolo Marchetti would die in one of them. It had taken 13 years. He had attended Rosa's funeral 22 years ago, quietly, in the back of a church. He had stood 10 rows behind her family and watched her husband Niccolo weep over the coffin. He had watched a small, sharp-eyed 9-year-old girl stand beside her father in a black dress, not crying, just looking up at her father's face as if to memorize it before she lost that too. He had stood in the back of the church and done the arithmetic he had been doing for 13 years at that point. Rosa chose Niccolo. Niccolo has a daughter. The daughter is going to grow up and inherit everything that should have been mine because Rosa chose the wrong man. 4 years after the funeral, Falcone had given the order that killed Niccolo. He had not given the order on the daughter. He had decided, with what he later considered to be an uncharacteristic mercy, that the daughter should be allowed to live, provided she was disposed of cleanly, shipped away, the hotel dissolved, the inheritance diluted, the name erased. He had arranged for the executors. He had paid the executors. He had watched, from a distance, as the hotel was sold, and the girl was sent to a boarding school in Switzerland with a stipend that would make her comfortable and never wealthy. He had not thought of her since. Except now. Now, sitting in suite 1404 of the Meridian Crown, watching a dark-haired woman in housekeeping livery walk out of the door with his boss's eyes on her back, Luca Falcone was thinking of her very, very hard. Vivienne. That had been the name, Vivienne Marchetti. The little girl in the black dress. He did not move. He did not change his expression, but his hand, resting on his knee, had gone very cold. He said mildly, "Dante." "Oh, that rose." "Yes. You should not eat from that plate." Dante turned. "What?" "I am being cautious. Call downstairs. Have a new plate sent up." Dante looked at him for a long, slow moment. "Luca," he said, "she's a maid." Perhaps. Perhaps. I am old, Dante. Old men are suspicious. Humor me." Dante looked at the rose. Then he looked at Falcone. Something had just happened between them that Dante, for the first time in a very long while, was able to see clearly. The cold animal inside Falcone had stirred, and the stirring had been small enough that no one else in the room would have registered it, but Dante was not no one else. Dante had been raised by this man. Dante had known every micro-gesture of this man's face for 24 years. Luca Falcone was afraid. Dante Valenti had seen Luca Falcone kill, and conspire, and lose, and win, and hold the hand of a dying rival with something that approached tenderness. He had never, not once, seen him afraid. Not until now. Dante picked up the white rose between 2 fingers. He rolled the stem gently. "I'll have a new plate sent up," he said, "just to be safe." "Thank you." "Luca." "Yes." "What is her mother's name to you?" Falcone smiled his indulgent smile. "I'm sure I have no idea what you mean." Dante set the rose down on the table. He said, "Of course." And he understood, in the next full minute of silence that followed, that he was not going to be able to wait until after the meeting. That something had gone wrong in his house a very long time ago, and that the small, polite woman in the hallway with the gray eyes and the wrong rose was the first honest piece of evidence he had seen in 24 years. 20 minutes later, he stood up. "I need some air," he said. Falcone looked up from his phone. "There's a bar on the rooftop. I'll join you." "No, Luca." "Dante." "I need 10 minutes, alone." Falcone's mouth opened, closed, opened again. 10 minutes, Dante repeated. He walked out the door. Falcone did not follow. He sat on the sofa, and he stared at the closed door, and he calculated, faster than he had calculated anything in 20 years, what his next move would be. He did not reach for the phone. He did not text the shooter. He simply reached up, with one steady hand, and unpinned the small gold crucifix he had worn inside his collar for 40 years. He set it on the coffee table beside the Amaro. Men who were about to pray for the first time in a long time did not pray wearing a crucifix. They prayed uncovered. Dante took the service stairs. He did not take his bodyguards. He waved them off at the stairwell door, and the senior of the two, a man named Bruno Rixai, who had been on Dante's personal detail for 9 years, opened his mouth to object and then closed it, because his boss's face, in that moment, was not a face a man argued with. Dante went down alone. He came out on the 8th floor, crossed to the guest elevator bank, took the car down to the 2nd floor, not the lobby, because the lobby would be watched by Falcone's eyes as well as his own, and exited into a mezzanine that overlooked the hotel's main atrium. The mezzanine was lit in the warm golden light that the Meridian Crown was famous for. The atrium below was 3 stories of white marble, a curving staircase, a Steinway at the base being played by an elderly woman in a gray dress, a long reception desk manned by 3 concierges in charcoal uniforms, and this was what stopped him, a small crowd of hotel staff clustered near the mouth of the service corridor at the far east end. Not clustered carelessly, clustered deliberately. They were standing in loose formation, 6 of them, maybe 7, a mix of housekeeping, security, bellhop livery. They were not looking at guests. They were looking toward something in the corridor, and their posture was the posture of people waiting for an instruction. A thin young man in the hotel's security uniform crossed the atrium floor at a fast walk. He was carrying an earpiece in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. He did not slow down when he passed the concierge desk. He did not slow down when he passed the Steinway. He did not slow down until he reached the cluster at the mouth of the corridor, at which point he handed the paper to a tall, older man in a charcoal suit. The older man unfolded it, read it, nodded once. Dante had seen the older man's face earlier that evening, briefly, across the lobby on the way in, the hotel's general manager, a gray-haired American with a neat mustache, but he had not really seen him. He was seeing him now. He saw the way the other staff oriented to him. The way a waiter passing through paused to meet the general manager's eye, received the smallest nod, and kept walking. The way the general manager's own attention did not remain on his staff, but instead, continually, returned to the mouth of the corridor. As if waiting for something to come out of it. As if waiting for someone. The general manager lifted his wrist to his mouth. Dante saw his lips move. He heard nothing. 6 people moved at once. 2 of the housekeepers peeled off toward the east wing. A bellhop left the huddle and walked toward a side door Dante had not previously noticed was a door. The young security man in the thin suit walked directly to the base of the grand staircase and took a position there, facing out, his hands folded behind his back in the exact stance of a man guarding a route. The general manager turned in place, adjusted his cuffs, composed his face. A door opened at the mouth of the corridor. Vivienne Reyes walked out. She was still in her housekeeping uniform. Her crown pin was still over her heart. Her dark hair was still pulled back so tight it looked painted on. She was still, by any surface reading, a maid. And every single person on that atrium floor turned their heads. Not obviously, not rudely, not with the hungry gawking of strangers at a famous person. They turn the way staff turn when the owner of the building walks through a room, a small collective adjustment of posture. The waiter at the far end of the atrium straightened his jacket. The concierge at the reception desk stopped mid-sentence with a guest and did not resume until the guest prompted him. The elderly woman at the Steinway, who had been playing a light Gershwin, lifted her hands off the keys for exactly 1 beat, a half-second rest that was not in the sheet music, and then, without looking up, resumed. It was the most choreographed silence Dante had ever seen. And it was happening in honor of a woman in a housekeeping uniform. The general manager stepped forward as she crossed the atrium. He did not bow. He did not curtsy. He fell in at her left shoulder and matched her pace at a distance of 18 inches, which was, Dante understood after a second study, the exact distance of a subordinate escorting a principal, not the distance of a supervisor walking with an employee. Dante could not hear what they said. He could see her lips move. He could see the general manager nod once, twice, a third time small crisp nods, the nods of a man receiving instructions, not giving them. He could see her hand lift briefly, the back of 2 fingers gesture toward the east wing, and the general manager's head turn to track the gesture and then nod again. The thin security guard at the base of the staircase had followed her progress with his eyes. When she passed him, he said, very quietly, "Mrs. Crown." Dante did not hear the words. He read them off the shape of the young man's mouth. "Mrs. Crown." The floor tilted under Dante Valenti's feet, for the first time since he was 17 years old. It did not tilt the way it had tilted in the butcher's shop. It tilted in a different direction, a slower direction, a direction that had been waiting for him for 2 hours in a corridor on the 14th floor. He stayed very still at the mezzanine railing. He watched her cross the atrium the way one watched a coronation. She did not look up. She did not know he was watching. She did not need to know. She was walking through her own house, briefing her own general manager on a crisis she had engineered, and the house was visibly, palpably, organizationally oriented around her in a way that Dante had not, in 24 years of running a city, ever managed to organize a room around himself. She reached the east wing. She paused. She spoke one more sentence to the general manager. He took a single step back, the step of a courtier given leave to withdraw, and inclined his head the regulation 2 inches. The same 2 inches she had given Dante in the hallway. She walked through the east wing service door. The door closed behind her. The general manager turned in place. He lifted his wrist to his mouth again. The atrium resumed its ordinary hum, so seamlessly that a guest who had looked up from his newspaper 30 seconds earlier would have, looking up again, noticed nothing. The Gershwin kept playing. Dante gripped the mezzanine railing. His knuckles were white. He had walked into this hotel 6 hours ago believing it was neutral ground. He had been standing, the entire time, in the middle of someone else's ballroom. He turned away from the railing. He walked toward the service stairwell. He had just started to descend when a door at the far end of the mezzanine opened, and a woman stepped out into the corridor in front of him, and he stopped. She was in a housekeeping uniform. She was crouched at the base of a brass column with a polishing cloth. She was Vivienne Reyes. The door she had just walked out of, through the east wing service door, had also fed back out onto the second-floor mezzanine, and she had known he was there. She had known. She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that had not been there in the corridor on the 14th floor. Not warmth, not apology. A small, precise mercy, the mercy of a person who had just allowed a man to see something he was owed. She said quietly, "Sir." Dante walked toward her. His bodyguards were 4 floors up. There was no one in the mezzanine but the 2 of them. He stopped 2 feet from her cart. "I need you to tell me," he said quietly, "what your father's name was." The polishing paused. She did not stand up. "Niccolo, sir." "Niccolo what?" "Marchetti." He closed his eyes for 1 beat, opened them. "Vivienne," he said. "Mr. Valenti." "Who are you?" "I'll tell you, sir, but not in this corridor." "Where?" "Suite 1404, 20 minutes from now. Alone. Ask your consigliere to go check on dinner for you. He'll go, he's afraid." "Why is he afraid?" "Because 20 minutes ago, I wore my mother's rose into your suite, and he remembered her name before you did." Dante stared at her. "Your hotel," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. All of it. All of it. And I. And you walked in tonight thinking it was neutral ground. It is not neutral ground, Mr. Valenti. It has not been neutral ground since I bought it 5 years ago, and the meeting you are about to walk into is not a peace meeting. It is an execution. Your consigliere has hired a shooter who will enter the dining room on the 32nd floor at approximately 9:45 and put 4 bullets into your chest. I moved the meeting. I intercepted the shooter 20 minutes ago. I am telling you now, in this corridor, because I do not wish to be the kind of woman who lets a man walk another 4 steps toward his own grave before I have had the decency to say it." He did not speak. She rose from her knees, smoothly, without effort, the way a person rises who had been crouching for professional reasons and not for menial ones. "Suite 1404, she said, 20 minutes. Alone. Alone. Vivienne." "Yes." "Tell me one thing." "Ask." Was the touch on my cuff deliberate? She did not blink. "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted you to know, Mr. Valenti, even before I told you, that you were in the hands of someone who had been paying attention. She lifted her polishing cart's handle. She said, over her shoulder very softly, "Send your consigliere to check on dinner. Do not let him near a telephone." She walked away down the corridor. Dante watched her until she turned the corner. Then he walked back upstairs. 22 minutes later, Vivienne knocked on his door. She was no longer in uniform. She wore black, a simple black dress, ankle-length, narrow cut, and a silver necklace at her throat with the crown insignia, not the hotel's but older, the coat of arms version used by her family in the 1930s when her grandfather had first pressed a die. Her hair was down. It fell to her shoulders in a dark, slightly waved curtain. On her left wrist was a thin gold watch. On her right hand a ring with a single black stone. Dante opened the door. Falcone had been sent downstairs 12 minutes earlier to supervise the new dinner plate. He had gone with great reluctance and an expression that the young boss had chosen, carefully, not to remark on. Vivienne walked in without waiting to be asked. She closed the door behind her. "Sit down, Mr. Valenti," she said. "We have about 40 minutes, and I intend to use every one of them carefully." He sat. She did not. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to the skyline, which was lit up behind her like someone else's prop. She said, "I'm going to tell you this in the shortest version. You can ask me for the long version over breakfast, if we are both alive to have breakfast. My name is Vivienne Marchetti Crown. My father was Niccolo Marchetti. My father was shot to death in this hotel on the morning of March 11th, 20 years ago, at 7 a.m. in front of his own office, by a man in a janitor's uniform who walked out of this building through a service entrance and was never identified. My father was killed by the order of your consigliere, Luca Falcone. Falcone killed my father for 2 reasons. One was that my father had refused, 3 times, to allow a Valenti laundering operation into the hotel's linen service. That was the pretext. The other, the private reason, the reason he has never written down and never said to another soul in 30 years, is that my father married my mother, Rosa, and Luca Falcone did not. He has spent 30 years of his life punishing everybody connected to that choice. My father, my mother's health, the hotel, the girl my father left behind." She paused. "I was the girl." Dante did not speak. "At the age of 14, she said, I was sent to Switzerland. At 18, I was sent home to Milan, where my mother's cousins had certain ideas about what my rehabilitation should look like. They sent me to a man named Raphael for training. Raphael is the man standing in the hallway outside your door right now, and the man who raised me into adulthood. He was a professional. The family wanted to make me a professional. They had ideas about where I could eventually be useful, and the longest conversation of my life happened in a small apartment in Milan with Raphael, the week of my 20th birthday, when I was expected to accept a contract that would have sent me to New York to kill a young mafia boss named Dante Valenti in retaliation for the death of my father, by the people who were still convinced, as I was still convinced, that it had been the Valenti family who had ordered my father dead. I accepted the contract. I did not fulfill it. Dante's jaw had gone very still. Why? Because Raphael was smarter than my mother's cousins. Raphael said, spend a year watching him first. If at the end of the year you still believe he is the man you were raised to kill, I will pull the trigger for you. So I spent a year watching you. And then another. And then another. It was supposed to be confirmation. It became the education of my life. She looked at him. Her eyes were the same slate gray they had been in the corridor, but they were steadier now, almost tender in their steadiness. 6 years into watching you, she said, I stopped wanting you to be the man I was raised to kill. 7 years in, I realized Luca Falcone was using you. 8 years in, I bought this hotel out from under the men Falcone had paid to keep it out of my hands. I did that because I wanted my father's house back. I did that because I wanted to build the evidence against Falcone inside his own blind spot. And I did that because this is the part of the truth I do not enjoy, because I wanted to be in a position, eventually, to save your life without you ever having to know it was me. I was not going to tell you any of this, ever. Tonight was going to be the night I saved you and left, and went on running my hotels on 3 continents. And you would have woken up in the morning with a dead consigliere and a functional empire, and a confusing memory of a maid in a hallway. And that would have been the entirety of our story. She was quiet for a moment. I changed my mind 8 minutes ago, she said. Why? Because you asked me about the rose. And because I have decided, Mr. Valenti, that the woman I have spent 20 years learning to be is not a woman who leaves a room quietly after the job is done. She is a woman who tells the truth to the man whose life she has just refused to permit ending, even at cost, especially at cost. Dante did not move. For a long time, he did not speak. He said finally, "My father." Yes, was my father. Innocent for what it's worth. Innocent of your father's role in my father's death. He never knew. Falcone handled it without his knowledge. Your father had his sins, Mr. Valenti. The murder of my father was not one of them. Dante's eyes closed. He said, Luca Falcone. Yes. Tonight. Yes. He is going to have me killed. In approximately 24 minutes, yes. The shooter has been intercepted. Victor Petrov is in the blue room on the 30th floor being briefed by Raphael. Victor's nephew, you would not have known this, but Victor's nephew was my fiancé 4 years ago. He was killed by the same broker's network that your consigliere hired tonight. Victor and I have been allies for 3 years. The meeting was a trap for you. It was also, if I did nothing, going to be a disaster for Victor and possibly the death of both of you. I would not have allowed that. I have not allowed that. Victor is your ally as of an hour ago. You will shake hands with him tonight under my roof, which is also in the oldest accounting his roof, because my mother was his first cousin and I am, in the Russian reckoning, his goddaughter. There are very few Russians left alive, Mr. Valenti, who love me more than Victor Petrov. The treaty you signed tonight will be a family treaty. It will hold. Dante stared at her. He said at last, your second reason. For this whole thing. I'm not sure I follow. Everything you just told me, he said. His voice had not risen. His voice had only thinned, the way a man's voice thins when it is speaking across 20 years of buried grief. The file, the hotel, the watching, the refusing to leave tonight without telling me. There is a second reason, tell me. For the first time that night, her composure cracked. Not visibly. He saw it because he had been trained by his own father to see small things. A single muscle moved at the corner of her mouth. Her fingers shifted half an inch against the fabric of her dress. She said very softly, 3 years ago, Atlantic Avenue, there was a dog. Dante did not speak. I watched a man stop 4 lanes of traffic for a dog, she said. I had been watching that man for 6 years. I had never seen him before in my life. I watched him carry a 3-legged terrier to a curb and hand it to a little girl who had been weeping. And I watched him crouch down in front of that little girl and speak to her for no reason except that she had been afraid. And I sat in the back of a car 2 lanes over, and I cried at a monitor for the first time in 20 years. And I said to myself, Vivienne, you are not allowed to do this. You have a life plan. The life plan does not include this. And I was wrong. I have been wrong for 3 years. I am wrong tonight. I should not be standing in this room in my own hotel telling you who I am. I should be in a car driving to Teterboro, but I cannot make myself be in the car. She looked at him. That is my second reason, she said. I am telling you because I have been in love with you since a Tuesday in March 3 years ago, and I am tired, Dante Valenti, of being in love with a man in secret while his own house tries to kill him. The suite was absolutely silent. He stood up. He did not cross to her. He did not touch her. He walked instead to the side table by the window, and he picked up the white rose she had left him, and he turned it in his fingers slowly, the way he had turned the wine glass earlier. My grandmother, he said. Yes. You know about my grandmother. I know about Nane Rosa. I know the day she died. I know you were the only one at her bedside. I know you still carry roses to her grave every Sunday. I know she was named, by the way, for my own mother, Rosa Marchetti. They were second cousins. I do not know if your grandmother ever told you that. I suspect she did not. It was a long and slightly painful branch of the family, but it's there on paper if you ever want to see it. He turned. His eyes were wet. Not crying. The surface sheen of a man who had not cried in 24 years and who was not going to start tonight, but who had arrived, for the first time in 24 years, at the shore of something that might have been crying if he let it in. "You know my grandmother's name is on my first trust document," he said. "I know." "You know Falcone was the second signature." "I know." "You know he signed it the morning after he killed your father." "I know, Dante." He set the rose down. "Come here," he said. She crossed the room. He did not kiss her. He lifted his right hand and placed it flat along the line of her jaw, the fingers reaching back along the curve of her neck, and he rested his forehead against hers, and he stood like that, breathing, for a long, quiet minute. He said, without lifting his head, "Luca Falcone is downstairs." "Yes." "You want me to walk him into that dining room?" "I want you to walk yourself into that dining room, Dante. I will walk him. I want you to be the last face he sees before the confession, and I want to be there when he makes it." "You want to be the one who takes it from him." "I have been waiting 20 years to take it from him. I am not surrendering that to anyone, not even you." He lifted his head. He looked at her. He had not, in 24 years, met his equal. "Vivienne Marchetti Crown," he said quietly. "Let's go." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, withdrew nothing, closed it again, an old, nervous gesture of his father's, the check for a weapon that was not there, and offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out the door of Suite 1404 together. Luca Falcone sat alone in the private dining room on the 32nd floor of the Meridian Crown Hotel. The walnut paneling around him had been installed in 1931. The long table in front of him had seated 17 presidents, 11 prime ministers, 4 cardinals, and on one quiet Tuesday evening in 1994, the signatories of a private treaty between 2 crime families that had, in that room, agreed to stop killing each other. The chandelier above the table had 81 bulbs. Falcone looked small under the chandelier. His phone was not buzzing anymore. The shooter was not calling. The cleanup team on the 29th floor was not calling. The north stairwell had not opened in 30 minutes. The hallway outside the dining room, which should have been alive with hotel staff rotating shifts on a busy Thursday evening, had gone, some minutes ago, absolutely quiet. Falcone had sat in many rooms over the course of his career. He had never, in any of them, been afraid of the silence. He had, in fact, built his career on silence. On the patient cultivation of the moment, when the only sound in a room was the breath of the one man who still had words left to say. Tonight, he was not the one with words left. The door at the far end of the room opened. Dante Valenti walked in alone. Falcone stood, out of habit, and then remembered that standing for Dante in this context was an old courtesy of a different life. He sat back down. Dante did not speak. He closed the door softly. He crossed to the far end of the table. He pulled out the chair opposite Falcone. He did not sit. He laid one hand, flat on the back of the chair. 24 years, he said quietly. Falcone did not answer. My father trusted you. I trusted you. I gave you the second signature on everything in my life. I let you sit at my table. I let you hold my grandmother's hand at her funeral 6 months ago. I let you eulogize her in a language I don't speak. A woman I have never spoken a word to before tonight just told me, in my own hotel suite, that you murdered a man named Niccolo Marchetti 20 years ago. She told me you did it because he married the woman you wanted. She told me you have been murdering men in my name ever since, using my resources, using my father's name, using my grandmother's goodwill. She told me, with documentation, that you paid a shooter in Queens 8 days ago to kill me in this room in approximately 4 minutes. I would like you, Luca, to tell me she was lying. Falcone's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The door at the far end of the room opened again. Vivienne Marchetti Crown walked into the room. She was not alone. Raphael walked behind her, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, iron-gray hair, the posture of a soldier who had retired into a new kind of soldiering, and behind Raphael 2 more of her men. One of them was carrying a tablet. The other was carrying what Falcone recognized, with the old cold animal inside him crawling into a position it had never been in before, as a retired federal judge named Harriet Sun, whom Falcone had once, 15 years ago, tried to have removed from the bench. He had not succeeded. Judge Sun met his eyes across the length of the dining table. She did not smile. Vivienne stopped at the head of the table, not Dante's end. The other end. The end her father had occupied when her father had sat at this table, in this room, 20 years ago. She stood where Niccolo Marchetti used to stand. She looked down the length of Walnut at Luca Falcone. She said, "Hello, Luca." He did not answer. "It's been a while," she said. "You knew my mother, I believe." Falcone's hand on the table, the steady hand, the hand that had been steady when he poured the Amaro an hour ago, the hand he had confirmed the steadiness of had begun, very slowly, to tremble. "Vivienne," he said. She tilted her head. "So you do remember my name?" "Of course I remember." "Good. I have spent 20 years of my life imagining this conversation, Luca, and I did not want to have to reintroduce myself." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, it was with the air of a man who had just taken the measure of his own coffin and found it longer than he had expected. He said very quietly, "How much do you have?" "Everything." "Define everything." "Every phone call you have made to the broker in Queens since 2009. Every wire transfer from the Valenti shell accounts to the 3 offshore vehicles you maintain in the Caymans, Panama, and Liechtenstein. Every sworn affidavit from the 3 retired Valenti lieutenants who were present in the room when you gave the order on my father, the 2 of whom I turned 7 years ago, and the one of whom, Marco Leone's uncle, turned himself in last Tuesday after his cancer diagnosis made him suddenly willing to find God. Every security tape from the 31st floor of this hotel the week of March 11th, 20 years ago, which you had destroyed but which I recovered last year, from the private archive of a retired night manager whose pension I have been quietly paying since I bought this building. The tape of you on the 31st floor landing at 6:47 a.m. on the morning of my father's death, handing an envelope to a man in a janitor's uniform. I have that tape, Luca. It is, by the way, remarkably clear." She paused. "I also have your phone call from an hour ago in Dante's bathroom to your man Ronaldo. That one is the fresh one. I like that one especially." Falcone said nothing. "I am going to ask you one question," Vivienne said. "You are going to answer it. If you answer it, you will survive this evening and go to a federal facility in the company of Judge Sun's court-martials, who are currently waiting in the blue room on the 30th floor, along with my friend Victor Petrov. If you do not answer it, I will honor Dante's original offer, which was to deliver you, alive and intact, to Mr. Petrov, who has been looking for the man who ordered the death of his nephew for 4 years, and who, coincidentally, is the same broker network you used tonight, which is the same network that served you on my father. You have created a great deal of mess with a very small number of vendors, Luca. It has made my work easier." She placed both hands flat on the walnut table. She leaned slightly forward. "My question is this," she said. "Did you kill my father because he said no, or because he said yes to my mother?" For a long time, Falcone did not speak. Then, very softly, in a voice that was no longer the voice of the Consigliere, but the voice of a young, sharp-eyed man who had once, 32 years ago, tried and failed to make a laughing, dark-haired girl love him more than the quiet, meticulous hotelier who already did. "Both," he said. Vivienne nodded, once. "Thank you, Luca." She straightened. She turned to Dante, who had not moved through any of this, who had stood at the far end of the room with his hand on the back of a chair, and had watched her do the thing she had, in fairness, told him she would do. She said softly, "He's yours." Dante walked the length of the table. He stopped beside Falcone. He laid one hand lightly on the shoulder of the silver-haired man. He said, "Luca, look at me." Falcone looked up. "You stole my life," Dante said. "You stole hers. You killed a man and a woman and an entire hotel to punish a dead girl for loving another man. You used my grandmother's name. You made me the face of your crimes. And I want you to know, before Judge Sun takes you out of this room, that I'm not going to kill you." Falcone's eyes closed. "I'm not going to give you to Victor either," Dante said. "Victor is going to have his opportunity, through Judge Sun's system, legitimately in a court in front of a jury, with everything Vivienne has built entered into record. You are going to die in a federal cell, Luca, slowly. With every piece of the paper we have on you made public, everyone you intimidated over 30 years is going to get to watch it. Everyone you killed, every family you broke, every name you erased, my father's name, her father's name, her mother's name, my grandmother's name, will be entered into the record that ends your life. You will not be a martyr. You will not be a king. You will be a file, Luca, a very long file, with footnotes." He lifted his hand off Falcone's shoulder. He said, "Stand up." Falcone stood. The two men at Raphael's shoulder crossed the room. They did not touch Falcone roughly. They flanked him. Judge Sun met them at the south door with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been waiting 15 years for this particular Tuesday. She nodded to Dante. She did not look at Falcone. They walked him out. When the door closed, the dining room was silent. Vivienne stood at the head of the table. Dante stood at the foot. The chandelier above them had 81 bulbs and was, for the first time in the life of the man who had once been Luca Falcone's boss, simply a chandelier. Not a prop, not a stage set, just a fixture under which two people were standing in a room that had, a moment ago, ceased to contain anyone else. Vivienne said, very softly, "Dante." "Yes." "Come here." He walked the length of the walnut table. He stopped in front of her. She reached up with one pale, steady hand and laid her palm flat along the side of his jaw. Her thumb rested at the corner of his mouth. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For what you just lost." He closed his eyes. "It was never mine," he said. "It was yours on paper. Paper isn't life." "No." "Vivienne." "Yes." "I don't know who I am tomorrow morning." "I don't either, Dante. We'll find out." He lifted his own hand. He placed it over hers, and he held it there against his face, and he did not let go. He said, "You stood in the corridor on your knees for me." "I stood in the corridor on my knees because I wanted you to see that I could stand up." "I see you." "I know." The kiss, when it came, was not the kiss of a conqueror, and it was not the kiss of a man relieved to be alive, and it was not the kiss of a boss and a subordinate, or a criminal and a civilian, or the two archetypes the rest of the world had been trying to shove them into for 20 years. It was the kiss of two people who had spent a great many years alone inside rooms nobody else had ever been allowed into, and who had just discovered, 20 feet from the chair where one of them had nearly died, that the doors of those rooms had, all along, been facing each other. She held onto his lapel. He held onto her jaw. Neither of them let go for a long time. Dawn was pink over the East River by the time it was all over. Falcone signed his confession at 4:46 a.m. in front of Judge Sun, 2 court marshals, and Victor Petrov. Victor rode down to the service entrance with him in silence. On the way out, Victor said one sentence to the marshals. They did not ask him to repeat it. Victor came up to the 34th floor at 6:15 a.m. and sat across from Dante in a small private study that had belonged to Vivienne's father. They drank very strong coffee and signed a treaty in ink that did not include a single bullet. Before he left, Victor walked over to Vivienne. She was standing by the window and laid one enormous hand on the top of her head and said, in a voice gone rough, "Your mother would be so proud." She nodded without looking up. He kissed the top of her head the way he had kissed it at her mother's funeral 22 years earlier. Then he left. She cried for the second time in 20 years after he left. Dante held her. He did not say a word. 17 men inside the Valenti organization were, over the following 4 weeks, quietly retired. The next 3 years became known, in rooms that did not speak such names aloud, as the Great Cleaning. Dante kept the shipping. He kept the legitimate real estate. He let the rest go. The Valenti name began to appear on the donor walls of hospitals, on the boards of opera companies, at christenings in Red Hook and block parties in Bensonhurst. Anonymously at first, then, at Vivienne's quiet insistence, attached to the face of a man the neighborhood had slowly learned to greet without fear. Vivienne did not publicly reveal herself as the owner of the Meridian Crown for another 18 months. When she finally did, in a short piece in the *** business section, her quote ran to one sentence. "My father built his life on the idea that a great hotel is a house where people far from home become family. I have tried to build mine on the same idea." They were married in the lobby of the Meridian Crown 3 years later, beneath the fresco of winged figures pouring honey from amphorae, on a Sunday afternoon in June. The elderly woman at the Steinway, who had played for Vivienne's father 40 years earlier, played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major at full tempo. Victor Petrov gave a toast that made Dante cry. Dante did not try to hide it. On the balcony after the reception, Vivienne leaned against her husband with a glass of champagne. "Do you know what I thought?" she said. "The first time you put your shoe on my brass." "What?" "I thought, this man has no idea he's standing in my house." He laughed. "I still don't, really." "No," she said, "you don't." "Vivienne." "Yes." "What changed, that night, between the hallway and the suite?" She looked up at him. The slate-gray eyes were clear and tired and warm in the evening light, and the small, pale scar above her left eyebrow caught the light the way it had in a hallway on a Thursday night in November, when a very tired man had looked down, and for reasons he had not then been able to name, stopped. "I saw you through the glass for 3 years," she said, "and thought you were a monster. I saw you through the glass for 3 more and thought you were a man. And then I watched you for 30 seconds in my hallway, and I realized you were the only other person in the world who understood the weight of being the thing everyone else believed you were. And I did not want that to die in a dining room." He kissed her forehead. "I don't deserve you." "No, you don't, but you're the only man I would have cleaned a shoe for." Below them, the lights of Manhattan came on block by block. The Meridian Crown had been standing on that corner since 1929. It would stand a great deal longer. Its quietest owner had made sure of that. And on the 32nd floor, in a walnut-paneled dining room under a chandelier of 81 bulbs, the chair at the head of the table, where Niccolo Marchetti had once sat, where his daughter had stood 20 years later to receive a confession, was empty and quiet, and for the first time in a very long time, at peace. Dante Valenti had walked into the Meridian Crown on a Thursday night in November, expecting to leave it at the head of an army. He had walked out of it, 48 hours later, the quiet husband of the only woman in New York who had ever looked at him without lowering her eyes. That was the night he finally understood the last thing his father had tried to teach him, in a butcher's shop in Little Italy, on the morning of his 17th birthday. The most dangerous person in any room, Dante, is always the one you don't see. He had spent 24 years watching for her. And when he finally saw her, she was on her knees in a hallway, polishing brass. And she had already, quietly, patiently, without ever raising her voice, saved his life.